after the hashtag. And interestingly, there's a nuance here, isn't there? If I say, after I've just been to see this show, hashtag amazing, I don't just mean I found it amazing. I mean, I found it amazing and I think you will as well. In other words, there's a reaching out with the hashtag, a kind of bonding that's taking place with that usage. And that was very interesting, I felt. So is that the end of the hashtag story? No, because you see, before too long, and my earliest references to this go back as early as 2014 or 13, people started to speak it, to introduce it into their everyday speech. And so, I was in a school not so long ago, and I heard these teenage kids, these were sort of 17-year-olds, that sort of thing, they were using hashtag in their speech. They'd say, hey, hashtag fantastic, or hashtag going to the toilet, things like that. It became a kind of another bonding sort of mechanism. And this has been picked up by the comedians. So if you actually go into Google later, when this conference is over, and type in, hashtag comedy or something like that, you'll get some lovely sketches from around the world. There's an Irish group that did it a lot, and an American chat show host who's done it too, and others. And they just have a little sketch where everybody says hashtag to each other all the time. And it's very funny, but it also reflects a reality. Now, it's a fashion. Is it going to last forever? I don't know. As I said at the beginning of the talk, it's impossible to predict the future of any language. And I don't know the future of English any more than you do. I can make guesses, of course, and estimate that certain trends are likely to continue. But it's perfectly possible that this time next week, if the conference had been held then, I would be talking about something entirely different. So add all these things together, all the stuff about global English, stuff about usage, stuff about, I haven't had time to talk much about usage this morning. Maybe that'll come up in a moment because we'll have a little bit of time for questions. And all the stuff about the internet, and you get, yes, 50 new pages in that book. It's really like writing a new book, really. 50 pages, that's 50,000 words. Woof, no wonder it took a year. So there we are, Harry and everybody. That was my 30 minutes, and I thought I'd stop now because I have another 10 or 15 to go, and be happy to answer a few questions that might come up as the next few minutes transpires. Sean, how are the questions going to be handled? Do I read them, or are you going to tell me them?
Would you like me to read them to you? That will put you on the spot, but I can read them to you if you want.
Oh, that would be great. Thank you very much, because then you can choose them, and then you can decide when we have to stop and move on to the next thing.
So how difficult can I make David Crystal's life? Okay. So Charlotte has just asked in the chat box, why do you think the increase in English language users is flattening?
Why? There may be a natural trade-off for any language. I mean, you need English. So how many people need it? Really need it? And it may be that we're reaching some kind of natural plateau. On the other hand, there may be other reasons. One reason could be the new technology that's around, which allows simultaneous translation. People using, translation apps of one kind and another. This is technology in its infancy, of course, because we've only had that kind of technology for just over a decade, really. But already it's made enormous strides. Well, anybody who's been using things like Google Translate knows that it's very clunky and it's not good on idioms and things like that, but it's a good way of conveying gist. And when you start using the Babelfish now and put things in your ear, these are early attempts at having automatic listening and speaking devices, then maybe that is going to be a factor that is already saying people are thinking to themselves, oh, maybe I don't need to learn so much English now as I used to. I don't know. There'll be other reasons. It's too soon to say really what the underlying reasons are. My feeling is that is that the number of people who really want to learn English for all sorts of everyday practical reasons may be reaching its maximum. David Graddall used to think this. He used to say that by 2050 there'll be no increase at all in the number of people learning English. It will have reached a natural level. I'm not quite. I don't think it'll be quite like that. I think people will always want to learn English and learn it, moreover, not just for everyday practical purposes, but to encounter the literature, for example, and the cultural side of English, which is another big development, of course.
Thank you. There are lots of questions. We'll see how many we can get through. Montasa asks, could you reflect upon the new language introduced by the pandemic, by the coronavirus pandemic?
Yes, well, it is new language, isn't it? Very little of it is actually new in the sense of coinages. Most of the words that I've encountered recently have been in the language for quite a long time, but they're being given a new application, a bit like, mouse meant an animal once upon a time, and then it became a computer device. Well, people use words like lockdown and self-isolation and things like that. They've been around a while, but not with this new application. I'm expecting more abbreviations and things like that to emerge as time goes by. The thing is that when people start coining words, they usually do so because, well, there's a playful motivation behind the coinage very often. People enjoy wordplay, they enjoy coining words and things like that. Well, we're not in the mood for joy, really, are we, for the most part? Although people are doing their best all over the place to keep their spirits high, this doesn't seem to be manifesting itself in all sorts of funny plays on words of the word COVID, for instance, which like Brexit did. Well, no, people are not doing that. Interestingly, the other day, you remember, it was April the 1st. Normally, April the 1st is full of all fools' jokes and tricks and things like that. Didn't see a single one anywhere, really. And so I think there's been limited development lexically at the moment. But this is likely to grow steadily as time goes by and people will get more used to it. And as we come out of lockdown, I suspect we'll see a big proliferation of people looking back on this period and starting to reflect on it, and then starting maybe to tentatively joke about it. And that's where we'll see a lot of new words coming in.
I think you've answered this within that answer, but I'll deal with the coronavirus kind of set of questions that have come up. So, Metin adds to that. Do you think social distancing will impact upon languages as well as lifestyles? Somebody else said, do you think online classes, the fact that we're teaching online, will have an effect on language? Any thoughts on that before we change?
Interesting, isn't it? Social distancing. What a terrible word that is. I tweeted about that and it got a couple of thousand retweets in no time at all. It's not social distancing at all. It's physical distancing. Social distancing is what we don't want at the moment. On the contrary, we want people to be as integrating as possible, to be mutually reinforcing as much as possible. I don't know who invented the term social distancing. It has actually quite a long history, goes back into the 19th century and is a very important term in sociology. But to use it to mean physical distancing, I think, in a sense, sends the wrong message, really. Physical distancing we need, but social interaction we want to reinforce as much as possible. And any technique for doing that's going to be fine. So online, yes, and indeed I'm doing a lot of online work at the moment, like many of you out there are, I know. Now, is it going to impact the language? Well, I don't see why it should particularly. There'll be new strategies, a few new interactive styles will emerge, as always happens. But when you look at the internet as a whole and ask the question, internet language today in 2020, how different is it from pre-internet language in 1989, shall we say? And the answer is, well, not much, actually, when you think about it. There have been a few new words, a couple of thousand new words, maybe more now, maybe 4,000 or 5,000, but that's a drop in the ocean when you think that English has got over 1 million words and more. New grammar? No, can't think of any new grammatical constructions that have emerged in the last 30 years, really. New trends, of course, but not brand new grammar. New spellings, a few. New orthography, a few points, a few. Minimalist punctuation or excessive use of punctuation, things like that. But these are minor points, and I'm not sure whether the increased interaction we're going to see at the moment is going to make any significant change in that. But, we're trying to predict the future. I don't know.
Yes, well, the future is a little bit uncertain at the moment, isn't it?
Sean.
Let's change tact a little bit then. So George asks, are varieties of English diverging or converging?
Oh, diverging always, really. I think that's the point of a variety of English, that it expresses identity. This is the big principle, isn't it? There are two main forces driving language: the need for intelligibility, which fosters standardization and brings things together, and the need for identity, which fosters individuality and pulls things apart. And language is always a balance between intelligibility and identity. So we have standard English on the one hand, and we have local Englishes on the other. Now there can be tension between these two, there often are, but the ideal language policy in my mind is one where there is a complementarity between the two. In other words, we all become bilingual or bidialectal in our English or whatever the language is. So at the one hand, I need standard English in order to communicate with all you guys out there. On the other hand, here in Wales, I have my local Welsh English, which I'm not going to use to you now. Although I already talking about it, I'm beginning to see my accent shift a little bit towards my Welsh English here. But I'm not going to use Welsh grammar or Welsh pronunciation much, or Welsh vocabulary. And we've all got this kind of thing. So American English and British English and Indian English and Singaporean English and all you guys that are in the public chat here and live streaming, in your country you have got a local English that is local to you, identifies you, and you should be proud of it. And not think, oh, it's not very good British English. Or why should you want it to be very good British English? I mean, it's your English. And I'm very strongly in favour of people developing their local varieties. And most places are doing so quite happily, and seeing it institutionalised in literature, in poems and plays and novels and things like that. And so this is, of course, the big difference that's going to take place. And this is something that might happen more on the internet. I'm not sure. As people develop their own local English, so the culture of their own part of the world manifests itself in that local English. And this is the point where we're seeing increasing differentiation between the varieties of English around the world. You go to a place and people are speaking English very fluently. All you teachers out there are chatting away in English in your country very fluently, and I'm listening to you. I've come to your country and I'm listening quite happily. And suddenly you say something and it's perfectly good English, but I don't know what on earth you're talking about, because it's something to do with the local culture that you know very well and you take for granted, but I don't know it. And the sort of thing that happens the other way round, of course, is when in British English I will say something like, oh, my watch here, it's not Bond Street, And people say, well, of course, if you know what Bond Street is, I'm basically saying it's not a very expensive watch. But if you don't know what Bond Street is, then you've no idea what I'm talking about. That's the sort of thing I mean, Or I say to you, oh, Lord, the M25. Well, why should I be so upset about the M25? You've got to have driven it to know. You've got to know the traffic jams that, well, used to be there. They're not there at the moment. Oh, it's just not cricket doing that. Oh, sorry, please, why are you talking about cricket? That kind of thing. Lots and lots of divergence there. These varieties, I think, are going to increase the amount of cultural differentiation. There's going to need to be a rapprochement in class, I think, between linguistic studies and cultural studies. It's already there to some extent. It's going to be much greater, I think.
Thank you. Don't mention cricket. It's the one thing I'm really missing in this lockdown period. Um, Harry is kind of combined a few questions for us. So it's the non-native element, and the question would be, how do you think the English language will be influenced by non-native speakers?
Oh, the future, the future, the future. I've no idea, but speculating. Numbers always count in language change. The majority always eventually produces a change in languages, the way it's always been. So I assume that's the way it will always be. So with 2.3 billion people out there and something like 400 million or so native speakers of English, as they say, then for every one native speaker, there are now 5 non-native speakers. So the center of gravity of the language has shifted from people like me to people like most of you out there. And this has to have a significant impact sooner or later. And what the impact is going to be is, as I say, unpredictable, but there are already signs of the sort of thing that might happen. If there's an aspect, for example, of English grammar that is universally felt to be quite difficult, you spend more time mastering it than anything else, then maybe in due course that's going to be a feature that will disappear. Or an aspect of English pronunciation that on the whole most people find difficult, then eventually that may disappear. And if most people in the world are doing it, then eventually maybe native speakers will follow suit. Now, what are examples? Well, uncountable nouns, for instance. I mean, everybody learning English at some point will say informations or furnitures and things like that. One assumes that nouns are going to be either straightforwardly countable or straightforwardly uncountable, but there are a whole tranche of nouns where they feel countable, and yet you've got to learn that they're not. And so when you go around English as a lingua franca, you find that this is undoubtedly one of the things that's turning up everywhere. People are saying informations and things like that all over the place. So could that become part of standard English? And the answer is yes, of course it could. And here's the surprise, guys. It was once upon a time. So if you go back to Chaucer's time, you will find information having a plural ending. And it went out of use in the 18th century because the prescriptive grammarians didn't like it. And so it became a non-S ending word. But it's still there. And in fact, I've seen it used recently by native speakers in special contexts, like in statistics, in accounting. I saw it recently, and in certain legal situations. So I wouldn't be at all surprised to find informations coming in to be a part of standard English over the next few years. And similarly, several other features like that. Oh, and I'm asked pronunciation. Well, just time to say, I don't give much of a future, frankly. TH, you know, I think in 50 years' time, I should be surprised if everybody's using it. Write and tell me.
That's interesting because I just had a question come in about have there been any changes in pronunciation? I guess recently. Is it the
oh, lots. I mean,
that?
yeah, there are lots and lots of changes in pronunciation going on. You will have heard most of them. In what, though? In what? People are mainly thinking, I suppose, about received pronunciation here. And what's happening, of course, nationally is that the number of people speaking traditional RP is falling, where it's down to about, I suppose, about 2% of the population of England now. And what we're hearing increasingly is mixed accents, modified RP, the sort of thing I'm using, which is not RP. It's not RP, no, but it's clearly relatable to RP. But even in RP, we're seeing lots of changes. The people who have been studying the speeches of Her Majesty the Queen have noticed over the past 50, 60 years how even her accent has shifted a little bit. 50 years ago, she'd say cup, whereas now she's more saying cup. And she'd say man, whereas now she's more saying man. And Oh, and the young people today, I mean, what's happening to the oo vowel, as in, you and soon and cool and so on. This lip spreading is taking place, isn't it? Cool, cool, not cool. It's cool, cool. Look at my lips, cool, ooh, 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 like that. So lots of specific changes taking place, indeed, and keeping up to pace with them is one of the big tricks of the trade.
So speaking of tricks of the trade, a number of people in the chat box have asked, how should teachers keep up with all these changes in English? How do they track the changes, say in spoken English, for example?
Well, yeah, well, there are lots of ways of doing it. I mean, thank goodness I'm not a teacher. I'm just a linguist here. I have the easy job. I mean, look, I got my books and my study and everything. I don't have to do the difficult job, which is go into a classroom and teach these people. I mean, that is the complicated job. And if I were in charge of the world, I'd want all teachers paid 10 times more than they're getting at the moment. Well, all of that. Okay. Yes, it's difficult. Because you've got to keep your fingers in so many pies. Pies you can keep your fingers in. Keep an eye on the corpora, on the big data. That's another section in the encyclopedia. There are very useful corpora out there now, which will really keep you up to date with what's going on in vocabulary and grammar in particular. Keep an eye on the internet. Keep an eye on social media in particular. Remember, this is the big shift, especially with younger people. For me, and I suspect for many of you, books were always central and the screen was marginal. For young people, the screen is central and books are marginal. And we've got to build that bridge, of course. But the point is, if you're going to see a trend taking place in spelling, in punctuation, and increasingly, of course, in pronunciation on things like YouTube and so on, then keep an eye on social media. I have to do the same thing, as a linguist. If I'm wondering, it's happened to me just yesterday. Well, I'm on lockdown here with son Ben here, who's in his 40s, all right. But a different generation. So when a usage point came up yesterday and I wasn't sure about whether it was changing, I asked him, get his intuition on it. And if I'm really uncertain, I'll Skype my grandson in Amsterdam and ask him. Reach out to the generations where change is taking place as much as you can. And of course, teachers have got an ideal situation here because they are in touch with young people routinely. So respect their change. That's the thing. Don't dismiss it. Because if you've come into conflict with a youngster who says, teacher, yesterday you said this, but on the internet I saw that, then you've got to be the flexible one, it seems to me. Because otherwise you're on a hiding to nothing. You will lose.
We've got about 5 minutes left, if you don't mind. So you've hinted upon the next kind of set of questions. So there are things like students conversing with images and emojis. Will that affect writing and the future of language? Will the fact that reading and writing is kind of being subsumed by watching instead now, will that affect language? What's your thoughts on kind of what you've just described as what young people are doing?
Isn't it interesting? I mean, almost all these questions are about the future. I haven't had any questions yet about the past. Maybe that's the way things are.
I do have a question about the past simple very shortly. So.
Oh, the past is tense. Right, the future. Well, don't overestimate these things. Emojis are a very, very tiny fraction of communication, basically. It's the same with text messaging abbreviations. We've seen the history of text messaging abbreviations now. As I said earlier, texting comes in round about 2001, 2002, a bit later in some other countries like the United States, but still in Britain round about then, probably in most of your countries too. And when it came in, everybody went, wow, this is fantastic. And they invented all kinds of new abbreviations, hundreds and hundreds. I've got a little dictionary on the shelves here with 1,000 text messaging abbreviations. None of them were ever used, hardly ever. And only a handful, like C for C and U for U and a few things like that, were ever frequent. And so as time went by, the novelty wore off. it peaked in about 2005, 2006 in Britain, and then it gradually started to fall away. So that if you go into a school now, as I do, or did, quite often, one of the things I did, you see, past simple tense, useful actually, Sean, after all, was to ask the students to gather together some text messages, and we'd analyse them together. And I went into this school not so long ago, and there wasn't a single abbreviation to be seen. So I said to the guys, you know, where have your abbreviations gone? And they looked at me as if I was from a different planet and said, they're just not cool anymore, you know. When we were young, said these 16-year-olds, we used to do them, but not now. They're not cool. And one lad said to me, tell you when I stopped using texting abbreviations. I stopped, he said, when my dad started. And ain't that the truth, you see? When older people steal young people's slang, it's no longer cool anymore. Now, I think a similar sort of thing is going to happen with emojis. They came along and became very, very popular, and they started to build up, but I see a flattening off already. And I see an interesting trend in emojis. You know that the people who introduce emojis online, in the Unicode system, they introduce them in tranches. Every few months a new set comes in. Well, for a while the new emojis were all content related, things like, you know, for a desk, or for a light, or for a computer, or for a telescope, or whatever it might be. But the last tranche that I looked at a few months ago, there wasn't very much by way of new content coming in. The emojis were all identity features. You remember the point I made a few minutes ago about intelligibility and identity? In other words, you know, white faces were being replaced by faces with different types of color. Male emojis were being supplemented by female emojis, and binary emojis and things like this. So suddenly identity features are becoming an important feature of emoji use. But still, only a very small proportion of communication uses them at all. And some online places are more frequent in their use than others. But and some contexts are more useful than others. I see more use of emojis and emoticons generally as a response to a stimulus than accompanying a stimulus. What do I mean by that? If I say to you, so I'm going to the party tonight, you might send me an emoticon or an emoji by way of reply and not say any words at all. That feature is still very common. But the one where I put an emoji or an emoticon at the end of a sentence, meaning that was a joke or something like that, that seems to be on the wane to some extent.
I reckon I've got time for a couple more questions. I don't know if you feel you've got time for another couple of questions, but Harry asked, Nigerian English has recently been included in the Oxford English Dictionary. So what do you think about subsequent inclusion from other local language lexicons?
Yes, I was surprised when there was some upset about that, because this has been part of dictionary business for decades. I mean, people have been saying we must have all varieties of English in a guide to the English language, especially a historical guide, which is supposed to be comprehensive. The OED is the classic case of this. So the OED has been incorporating usages from around the English-speaking world for, well, at least since the 1940s, maybe even earlier. And so if you go to the advanced search section of the OED, and type in things like, you know, Indian English or something like that, you'll get all the Indian English words that have turned up over the last, well, since they started doing this. And this is nothing new at all. And on the whole, people have been saying, why isn't my variety of English in there? Come on, you know, we're in such and such parts of the world. We've got our English too. We want it to be represented in the in the big reservoir of English that the OED is. Here are some examples, and people have been sending things in. So the OED people have been steadily including these, and most places don't seem to worry about it at all. And I was amazed when I saw that there was some fuss about Nigerian English, because this seems absolutely standard lexicographical practice. So the poor lexicographers are in between, as we say, a rock and a hard place. You know, if they do it one way, they get criticised. If they don't do it, they get criticised. If they do it, they get criticised. Well, lexicographers have got thick skins. They've always been like, I can't see the process stopping just because a few people get upset by a few words that they feel shouldn't be in the dictionary at all.
Okay, your penultimate question is, what's your next book on? A lot of people have asked that.
Thank you. The next book is a book called Let's Talk, and the subtitle is How English Conversation Works. And it's a book I've been wanting to write for a long time, basically about pragmatics and conversation and so on. People with a long memory will remember that back in the 1970s, Derek Davey and I wrote a book for ELT called Advanced Conversational English. Well, you know, I haven't been addressed that topic since. So this Let's Talk book, published by OUP, out supposedly on the 23rd of April. No, it's been delayed because of distribution difficulties with the publishers. It'll be out now on July the 9th, I think. And maybe this time next year, assuming we're all alive and well and in Harrogate, I might be able to talk about it then. But that's the next one anyway. Let's Talk.
Thank you. And your final question has been asked again a number of times, and it's very relevant. Are you wearing pajamas?
No, this is my best shirt with long sleeves. And
I think it's the standard, you know, we're all the shirt at the top, but everybody wears their pajamas.
Oh, listen, I will show you what I'm wearing underneath. Maybe if you can just see my knee there, you will see a streak of white paint going along the side. This is what I've been doing during lockdown, as well as trying to write some books and doing things online and keeping our Shakespeare's Words database up to date and things like that. I've been doing some painting, like a lot of people have.
And there we go. Thank you very much, David. It is now 11 o'clock, so we should hand over. And I just want to say thank you so much for your talk, for opening up for us, for giving up your time, and of course answering all those questions with such authority. Thank you so very much for your time.
Been a pleasure. Thanks, everybody. Have a great couple of days and look forward to seeing as many of you as possible at Harrogate next year. Bye for now.
Thank you, David. Okay, so now we're going to wrapping up the first session. You'll see a little bit of a changeover. Oh, look, the road is back. Hi, Hilary. You'll see a little bit of changeover as we change things over. For it, let's change over to that side so David can turn off his camera and microphone, and I'll hand over to the team to sort out the next speaker, who will start in about 15 minutes.
Okay.